Scott Pilgrim vs. the World burst onto the big screen with critical praise in the summer of 2010. This British, Japanese, Canadian-American beast of a thrill ride was built on the backs of director Edgar Wright, screenwriter Michael Bacall, and of course, the OG creator, Bryan Lee O'Malley, who penned Scott Pilgrim's Precious Little Life back in 2004. O'Malley's shonen-inspired comic book was picked up for a film adaptation immediately following the success of Volume 1, thus, the comic series and the screenplay were both developed simultaneously.
Wow.
Much of the movie is highly faithful to the original work, save for a few missing plots, characters, and of course the ending, which O'Malley wrote after the screenplay was finished. So what do you say, Clint? You all geared up and ready to find some differences?
Yeah, Casey? Yeah.
All right then. Without further ado and no restraint on spoilers, what's the difference? While the events of the movie span about a week, the book's plot spans just over a year. The movie focuses on the main plot of the evil Exes and thus drops secondary story arcs such as Sex Bob-omb's album recording, Scott's job as a dishwasher, his family, and Kim's living situation. The film also glosses over elements that are more integral to the plot of the comic, such as subspace. They use it here. That bag is made of subspace, wow!
The characters, however, remain mostly the same, except for Ramona, who comes off colder in the movie.
Is that seriously the end of the story?
One could speculate that the filmmakers wanted to steer the audience's sympathies towards Knives, who, in the original ending, Scott was supposed to end up with.
She's too good for him.
Oh, I know, Scott's a total dick. But even so, the movie focuses the perspective on its protagonist, while everyone else falls into the background. Whereas the comic spends time with all the characters by switching perspective and pairing them up in different combinations.
Having said that, the movie's first act is almost identical to Volume 1 of the comic. Scott still dreams of Ramona and searches for her at Julie's party, except in the comic he describes Ramona using his fingers, while the movie gives us this charming little drawing. Both Scotts nervously make small talk with his dream girl, but in the movie he tells her about Pac-Man, while in the comic he awkwardly compliments her shoes.
I think your shoes are pretty cool.
Of course, his awkwardness eventually wins Ramona over, but in the comic, they actually move in together.
The film doesn't get that far.
Blah blah blah. Enough of this mushy crap. Let's fight!
The battles in the movie are an amalgamation of different fight scenes from across 5 different volumes. And because the movie is less focused on the ensemble, Scott throws most of the punches, as opposed to the comic in which Scott gets help from the others. Sex Bob-omb and friends join the fight against Patel, Crash and the boys aid him against Todd, and even Knives' father steps in for a few rounds against Roxy.
Anyway, let's tackle the differences one evil X at a time, shall we? At number 1, we have Matthew Patel. The scene plays out similarly in both versions. Sex Bob-omb goes up against Crash and the boys in the first round of Battle of the Bands, but in the comic, Crash and the boys end their set with a song titled Last Song Kills Audience, which knocks most of the audience unconscious. In the movie, Knives is the only one to faint, but not because of Crash and his boys. Just that piping hot Sarah sex appeal. Eventually, Scott and Patel go at it, which culminates in a Bollywood song battle. Minus the fact that Sex Bob-omb helps defeat him in the comic, the fight ends the same way in both versions.
Next is Lucas Lee, the dickhead action star turned evil X number 2. In the movie, Scott and Ramona drop by the set to meet with Wallace, who is camped out to get a glimpse of his celebrity crush. But in the comic, Wallace doesn't even like Lucas Lee. In fact, he calls him a douchebag sellout, which he totally is. Scott and Lucas take a break from fighting to have a heart-to-heart talk over some baby carrots, and Lucas offers to throw the fight for a bribe. Scott obviously doesn't take this route, but instead dares Lucas to grind the treacherous staircase, which also happens in the movie. But in the comic, Lee's defeat produces a mithril skateboard item, but movie Lee only leaves behind, like, coins.
What a cheap ass.
The kick-ass fight with Lee's stunt doubles only appears in the film, although there is a similar fight in a Scott Pilgrim one-off that was released on Free Comic Book Day just 1 month before the film premiered.
At number 3, it's everyone's favorite vegan Todd. In the movie, Sex Bob-omb opens for Clash at Demon Head and everyone ends up in the green room at the behest of lead singer and Scott's ex-flame, Envy Adams. The scene gets tense after Todd punches the highlights out of Knives Chow's hair and Scott challenges him to a throwdown.
You'll pay for your crimes against humanity!
But he is no match for Todd's vegan powers and even less so against his mad bass skills. Backed into a corner, Scott outwits Todd by slipping half and half into his drink, which summons the vegan police, who take away Todd's powers.
But in the comic, the fight against Todd is not as concise. Knives still puts her foot in her mouth, but it's the band's drummer that punches the highlights out of her hair. With a bionic arm, no less. The drummer henchman is in the movie as an Easter egg right about there.
Man, it would have been cool to see her throw some cyborg punches. Oh well.
Scott still picks a fight with Todd, which he of course loses, but a few days later they duke it out in Honest Ed's, the world's most terrifying superstore, which only makes a brief cameo in the movie. Eventually we come to yet another Clash at Demon Head show where Sex Bob-omb shares the opening slot with the boys in Crash, formerly known as Crash and the Boys. The boys help Scott during the base battle, but in the end Scott is only saved by the vegan police who show up unprompted and completely out of nowhere. Scott simply lucks out and takes advantage of the situation.
Number 4 brings us to Roxy, or Roxy, if you're in the movie.
Her?
Both movie and comic Scott are slow to understand Ramona's sexy phase, but while the movie gives us a needlepoint, the book has Scott's brain crack open, revealing a baby chick. Ramona then has to get her hands dirty in a fight that is reminiscent of Ramona's fight with Envy in the comic, giant hammer and everything. It's in this comic version of the fight that Scott stops Envy with a finger to the back of the knee, but the movie repurposes this moment as a means to finish off Roxy with an orgasm. If that wasn't clear.
It's clear enough.
Finish off.
I think we get it.
But in the comic, Ramona fights her bi-furious ex with a titanium baseball bat in subspace. And while comic Roxy wields a katana, movie Roxy uses her belt? A sword whip? I don't know what to call that. Comic Ramona never takes control of Scott's limbs like she does in the movie. That was yet another element derived from the comic book day print we mentioned earlier. Eventually, Comic Scott KOs number 4 by slicing her in half with the power of love. Roxy splits and bursts open, releasing the cutest woodland creatures you've ever seen. I dare you to disagree.
Coming in at numbers 5 and 6 are the Yanagi Twins. What takes an entire volume to resolve in the comic is knocked out quickly at the final battle of the bands in the movie. Scott notices Ramona and Gideon in the crowd, who gives a "kill that guy" nod. Without a single word spoken between the two, the twins fight Sex Bob-omb with mythical creatures brought forth through their music, ultimately pitting electronica against the power of rock. But the twins are no match for Sex Bob-omb's Green Yeti.
Yeah, f*** you, dragons.
The twins are laid to rest while Scott gains an extra life. But in the comics, Scott gains the extra life after defeating Todd way back in Volume 3. In the comic, the twins taunt Scott for days, both with words and, get this, robots!
Oh, cool.
Scott gets tossed around for pages and pages until eventually the twins resort to kidnapping Kim, which of course lures Scott into a trap. This time, Scott fights the twins themselves, who attack simultaneously, beating him down and breaking his spirit. Just as all seems lost, Kim pipes in to relay a text from Ramona, which is a lie of course, but it's enough to light a fire inside our hero. With a ka-chow, leap, and pock, Scott decimates the Yanagi Twins and collects the sweet Canadian currency.
Movie Scott then chases after Ramona, who sides with Gideon. G-Man signs Sex Bob-omb to a contract, leaving Scott alone and out of the band. Look, you can even see the sadness right there in Scott's eyes. But Comic Scott returns home after defeating the twins, only to find Ramona slowly dissolving into subspace. She doesn't leave with Gideon, she just leaves.
And as if this isn't bleak enough, Stephen Stills informs Scott that he's starting a new band without him. Sex Bob-omb is no more.
More like Sex Bob-bummer.
Yeah, I know, right?
Last but not least is the king of evil dicks, Gideon f***ing Graves. Now, because the last volume was finished long after the screenplay was penned, the comic takes inspiration from the film in a bit of a role reversal not common in the adaptation world. Both Scotts spend time wallowing in a depressed funk, but it's comic Scott who seeks comfort in the idea of casual sex with Knives, Envy, and even Kim. Movie Scott gets a quick pep talk from Wallace and shoots off to the Chaos Theater for the final fray with Gideon himself, while Comic Scott must face Nega Scott in order to come to terms with his behavior and the hearts he has broken. His acceptance of Nega Scott is what ultimately motivates him to travel to the Chaos Theater for the final confrontation, as opposed to the movie, which has a brief interaction between the two Scotts after the fight with Gideon.
You get bacon on the side. I'm liking that. Oh, let's do it next week. Yeah, that's cool. Yeah, all right. Be good. Yeah.
In the movie, Sex Bob-omb's set is interrupted by Scott's beef with Gideon. But in the comic, it's Envy Adams who owns the stage at the Chaos Theater. Not only that, she's the one who's now with Gideon, not Ramona. Ramona isn't even there.
But of course, she is in the movie. Scott professes his love for her and earns the sword Comic Scott earned during his fight with Roxy.
But the power of love is no match for the boss man's sword, and Scott is thrown to the ground. The scene gets even more action-packed when Knives jumps in to confront Ramona. The fight in the movie more reflects a fight between Ramona and Knives in the reference library earlier in the comic book series. But let's get back to the Chaos Theater. In the comic, Gideon attacks Scott from behind and steals the power of love right out of Scott's chest.
What a dick!
It's here that Gideon offers him a spot in the league. But movie Gideon doesn't even bother. He just sticks his sword straight through Scott's chest, which also happens in the comic, albeit in a more brutal fashion.
So now both Scotts are dead. But Ramona still finds a way to comfort him. Although in the movie she explains why she went back to Gideon and reveals the mind control chip on her neck. But because she never went back to Gideon, comic Ramona returns to apologize for giving up on them so easily.
Aw, that's sweet. Too bad Scott's dead.
But wait, both Scotts grabbed an extra life. Movie Scott starts the level all over again, but this time scores more points by doing right by everyone.
In the comic, Scott revives at the same moment he died, and Ramona finally makes her entrance. Then Gideon reveals his plan to cryogenically freeze her as part of some creepy ex-girlfriend collection. Ramona has a tussle with her ex, but Gideon has a secret weapon. He wields the power of emotional warfare with a virus called the Glow. This is what keeps Ramona under his thumb, not a mind control chip. It's also used to manipulate Scott's memories, but to be honest, it's a little too convoluted to go into right now, so you should just pick up the comic and wrangle that weirdness yourself. Before Ramona can escape, Gideon impales her with his sword, forcing Scott to crawl into Ramona's head using that good old-fashioned subspace. This brings us to a confrontation with the Gideon that Ramona can't let go of. But with the help of the many shades of Ramona, Gideon is finally defeated, and Ramona is free from his evil grip.
In the movie, Scott decides to fight Gideon for himself, earning him the power of self-respect, which he uses to stop Knives and free Ramona from Gideon's control.
In the comic, Ramona earns her very own power of love, while Scott earns the power of understanding. Both join forces and deliver the combo that bursts Gideon into a shower of coins.
In the movie, Scott confesses to cheating on Knives with Ramona, but in the comic, Knives is the one who lets the cat out of the bag, and Ramona confronts a sleepy Scott in bed. Anyhow, Scott does right by the ladies, but the big bad only gets badder. And while Ramona does inflict some damage, she's knocked out of the fight, which leaves Scott and Knives to finish him off.
Yeah, I think you're misunderstanding the phrasing there.
Okay. Both the comic and the movie end with Scott and Ramona reunited, prepared to give it another go. Although the comic has another blossoming couple in Steven Stills and Kim's roommate.
And if you ask me, these crazy kids just might have a chance.
I think you're right.
Now I bet you either want to pick up the comic or pop in the movie or play the game or check out Scott vs. the animation. There are so many mediums to choose from.
And while this is the end of our episode, it's not necessarily the end of all the differences. There are so many more on such a microscopic level, so sound off with your favorite minor differences in the comment section below, and don't forget to like this video and subscribe to CineFix for more What's the Difference?